evening, friends. I know we still have folks joining us, but in the interest of time, we have a great program tonight, so I want to get started. If you would all join me here after the manner of friends for a brief moment of silence. Thank you so much. Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anna Wyeth, and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special Conversation with Friends event. Before we get started, I have a couple quick housekeeping items. I want to encourage everyone, if you can, to keep your video on if you feel comfortable doing so. That will really help us all feel the full participation of everybody who's here. I also want to ask you, if you can, to change your Zoom name to include your full name and add how you are connected to the Sidwell Friends community. So your class year, if you're an alum, or if you are a parent, a parent of an alum, a current parent, a grandparent, perhaps a current or former faculty or staff member. And if you've never changed your name on Zoom before, you can do so by hovering over your own name in the participant list and clicking that More button. And then you can rename yourself to add that information. You can just think of it like our little virtual name tag that shows us who is here. I'll ask that everybody keep themselves on mute just to minimize disruptions. We'll save asking questions for the end of the event with a dedicated Q&A portion. We've had a lot of questions come through from folks when they registered. But of course, if you have a question you want to ask tonight, please send it to me, Anna Wyeth, in the chat, and I will add it to the queue for our Q&A. This Conversation with Friends event tonight is co-sponsored by our DC Regional Alumni Club. As most of you all know, we have 6 regional alumni clubs here in the country where we have the concentration of the most alumni, and not only DC, but in New York, in Boston, Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And of course, by virtue of being here in the same city as the school, since this is the place where we have the largest number of alumni, we get a lot of special opportunities to do programs and events here that are unique. So of course, tonight, this is a virtual event and folks are coming from all around the country, but the idea behind tonight's conversation came from our DC Club committee. So I wanted to say a special thanks to them, and especially to Shaba Lightfoot, class of 2000, who is the clerk of that committee. And now, finally, the reason we are all here tonight, I'm so excited to kick us off with our featured speakers with this panel. I'm going to introduce our moderator, Eliza Leighton, who is the class of 1991. Eliza is a social entrepreneur with extensive startup, management, strategic planning, and fundraising experience across sectors. Most recently, she co-founded The Family Room, which is a technology company to connect children and their loved ones when separated by distance. Through her consulting firm, she's provided support to the leadership of dozens of national and regional social change and political organizations in core organizational growth and management areas. She's also an adjunct training coach with the Management Center, where she's trained thousands of managers on fundamentals of people and work management. Prior to founding her consulting company, which is Leighton Wright Consulting, and The Family Room, she worked at Casa de Maryland in a number of capacities, including as the director of the Langley Park Promise neighborhood and the director of strategic initiatives. And she was the co-founder and former deputy director of Stand for Children. She began her career in government with positions in the Domestic Policy Council in the White House and at the Democratic National Committee. More recently, she has filled volunteer leadership positions in statewide races. She has a JD from Yale and her undergrad at Wesleyan. And she and her husband, Josh, are the parents of 2 current Sidwell students, Aviva and Isaac, and their 3rd child, Maya. So Eliza, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thank you, Anna. It's really great to be here. It is really fun to see familiar faces, see familiar names. So thanks everybody for joining us. I want to just start by saying thank you to Anna and her colleagues, Rachel and Gabriella and Zuhar, for organizing tonight. It's really wonderful to have these opportunities to come together. So thank you all very much for this. So when Anna reached out and asked if I'd be part of this panel, I said, of course, as my fellow panelists did also. And then she said, and the topic is going to be the future of US elections, lessons from 2020. And we all probably thought in our own ways, okay, nice big topic there, right? Let us dig in. And then we started talking and we figured, you know, we have an hour. Will we really have enough to fill that time? We thought, let's just wait for the 2021 elections to come by too. So we then postponed, I'm joking, we didn't postpone for that reason, but we did then, right, postpone the event. So thank you to all of you who are coming back a second time with the date change. And now we have 2 elections to talk about. So it's gonna make this conversation all the richer. I will say that we all recognize that this is a lot of topic, a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time. And so we're going to do our best to sort of make our way through a number of areas that you all so graciously shared that are of interest to you when you were registering for the event. So we are joined tonight by 3 very experienced practitioners in a variety of different spaces, all having to do with elections and electoral politics in this country. So we have Ben Wessel, class of '07. I wish I had more like fun tidbits to like share about folks. So but I'm doing a little bit of a straight bio, and maybe we'll get a little bit more of the flavor here of what everyone was like when at Sidwell. So he's the former executive director of Next Gen America, the nation's largest youth voter mobilization organization. At over 7 years, spending 7 years at Next Gen, Ben oversaw a program that registered more than 1.5 million young people to vote, garnered record youth voter turnout, both in 2018 and 2020, and helped progressive candidates win from the State House to the White House. Prior to his time at Next Gen, Ben worked for Cory Booker's first Senate campaign in New Jersey, Barack Obama's re-election campaign in 2012, and in a variety of capacities in the youth climate movement. So welcome to Ben. Doug Thornell, class of '95, is a partner at SKDK, a strategic communications firm, where he leads the political advertising department. In the 2020 election cycle alone, Doug oversaw an advertising department that produced over 800 political ads. In his over 20-year career, Doug has been a lead media specialist to the Democratic National Committee, the top spokesman for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, a senior aide at the DSCC, a top advisor to both Senator Chris Van Hollen and the Congressional Black Caucus, and the traveling spokesman for Governor Howard Dean's 2004 presidential campaign. Capping it off, this is really, okay, so capping it off, National Journal just recently named Doug to their recent list of the 50 people changing the game in Washington, and wrote that he is, and I quote, one of the most plugged in public affairs professionals in Washington, period, full stop. All right, so welcome to Doug. And then Hannah Bristol, class of 2010, was the National Young Americans Engagement Director on the Biden-Harris campaign. She has worked on the presidential campaigns for Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Elizabeth Warren, as well as at Next Gen America, where she led a program that registered more than 250,000 young people across 11 battleground states for the 2018 midterm elections. I'm wondering if Hannah and Ben are double counting. Is that what's going on here? I see, okay. I'm not sure who gets credit for that, but it's a heck of a lot of people. So there's plenty to share around. How about that? She currently serves as the Associate Director for Public Engagement in the White House, where she works with young people and the LGBTQ+ community. So welcome, Hannah. All right, so those are our panelists for this evening. I just wanted to give everybody on the call sort of a sense of where we're gonna go in this conversation. We're gonna start with a backwards look, going back to 2020 and last week's elections. We're then gonna pivot and talk about a number of key events and changing demographics that are having a big impact on past elections and will in the future for upcoming elections. We're going to talk about tensions within the party and how those are playing out and what maybe to expect looking forward to upcoming elections. And then we will pivot into our forward look, what to expect. And I know there was a number of questions from folks about like how to engage. So we will have some opportunity for some comment and reflection on that. So that is where we were going. And as Anna said, there will be a brief amount of time for questions towards the end. So please feel free to share those. All right. So starting with our recap. So we are curious to hear from everyone, from the three of you, about lessons you think are important to take away from the 2020 presidential election. And if you can think about this in the context of the elections that just happened last week, which of those key lessons do you think were really reinforced by what we saw happen around the country last week? And which, if any, did you start to reconsider now with another sort of election cycle under your belt? Which did you maybe start to reconsider or think differently about? So I'm going to ask Hannah if you can start by sharing your reflections.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Eliza, for those introductions. And yeah, Ben and I have worked together a lot, so we're thrilled to talk about young people, which is what both of us have especially specialized in, but we're really excited to be here with you all today. Just first want to lay out that I'm here in my personal capacity, so everything I'm saying is just my opinion, not the opinion of the administration. But you know, I had the privilege of leading the Biden-Harris campaign's youth engagement in the campaign. I came on in July. Prior to that, I was working for Elizabeth Warren in the primary, and I think that one of the big things that we really wanted to focus on moving into the general election, and I also ran Hillary Clinton's youth program in Virginia in 2016. And we ended up coming in a really similar landscape. You know, it felt like we knew young people voted for other candidates in the primary at high rates, and we need young people to turn out in record numbers as they did in 2020 in order to make sure that that we were able to win. And so in 2016, one of the challenges that we had is that we didn't do as much, like we didn't paint as much of like a vision for why young people should support us. You know, I would talk to college students in Virginia and they would be like, I voted for Barack Obama, my life is still the same. You know, what is this going to do for me? And a lot of our messaging was very much rooted on, you know, like love trumps hate, which is a great message, but isn't showing people what you're really working towards. And so as we were thinking about how we were messaging to young people, we knew that we really needed to paint a picture of what it means. You know, what is the Build Back Better agenda? What are young people? What are the challenges that young people are facing, and what do they stand to gain? And that was really the focus of so much of our messaging. You know, I think that there has often been a misconception that young people are not that politically impacted. You know, that we're just like cute. We love, you know, to do fun things. We are out here like voting, and that's cute. But like we're cute, and also we're really politically impacted, and this has a really big, you know, from like the unemployment rates to higher education to gun violence to racial justice, like climate change, all of these issues deeply impact young people in the futures that we're going to have, even young people who can't vote. And you're seeing that in schools with, you know, kids whose lives have been so deeply impacted by the politics of mask mandates and vaccinations and, you know, all of that's impacting their ability to learn, and they don't have any say in the political process. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were talking to voters of all ages like they were, you know, informed people who were capable of making their own decisions and who had something that they really needed to hope for and paint a vision for what they were going to get, not just capitalizing on fear and focusing on what people weren't going to get. And I think we really saw that in 2020 when you look at the approval, the favorability ratings among young people with the Biden-Harris ticket. It improved 40 points between May and Election Day, which was far and away the biggest gain of any other demographic. And so I think one of my biggest takeaways is that you really need to show people what they're going to vote for. You really need to teach people like who you are and introduce yourself and earn every vote with a vision. And you can't just take for granted that people will know you or that they'll vote because they're afraid or because of what they don't want. And we really need to make sure that, you know, we're continuing to tell the story to people of what that change looks like and that their vote really matters.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. Doug, pivot to you.
So first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you guys. You know, I think so if we look at 2020 and if we look at the election that just happened last week, I think what we saw in 2020 was an incredible amount of discipline from the Democrats, particularly Biden's campaign, on a message that centered around essentially restoring the soul of the country and rebuilding the middle class. And they never wavered from that message. It was the message that they ran on in the primaries. It was the same message in the general. Biden didn't move to the left or to the right. He was who he was. There was a lot of consistency there. They didn't chase a lot of shiny objects, which is what I think the right it wants us to do, wants Democrats to do. And I think that message consistency was critical to Biden's victory. I think there were a couple other things just in terms of voter engagement that were really important. I ran the entire advertising program for the NAACP in 2020, and we began organizing and running ads targeting high propensity voters early on in June of 20 to try to get them to communicate with low propensity voters, pick 5 or 10 voters that were in their community, in their neighborhood, creating a sense of, creating buzz in the community. And then we transitioned to a program where we communicated directly with low propensity voters. And we went to where they were. We didn't just sort of like throw stuff up on TV, although we did throw a couple things on TV, but most of it was digital, a decent amount of radio, a lot of texting, and the places where we ran that program saw a higher percentage of turnout among Black voters. And I think whether we're talking about Black voters or Hispanic voters or young voters, I think it's really important that you start early with that communication. So that's 2020. I'm going to do 1 second on 21, and then I'll let Ben take it. I think what happened in 21 was a collapse of both of the things I just talked about. One, there was no message from Democrats. Now, if you think about, no one should be surprised about what happened in Virginia, because for the last 3.5, 4 months, it's been terrible news coming out of the Capitol, coming out of Washington. Whether it was around the infighting around the infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better bill, whether it was Afghanistan, whatever it may be, all of that news was coming out. Independents, get a lot of their news from CNN, and CNN is basically, reporting on what is happening with this process. So it shouldn't be surprising that when you look at independent voters, Biden won independent voters by 19 points in Virginia in 2020, and Youngkin won them by 9 in 21. That's a 28-point shift. And so when you're looking at the suburbs, it was a similar thing. Biden won them by 8, Youngkin won them by 7, a 15-point shift. So, where news is coming from, where people consume their news matters, message matters, and connecting and communicating with voters early matters as well.
All right, Ben.
Let me chime in as someone who doesn't watch CNN and doesn't have a TV, like a good millennial. And I live out in San Francisco, so I didn't get any of those ads about Virginia. And so I think I approach this question as a bit more of a structuralist of what was going on that got people to the polls. And one of the things that we know about the 2020 election was it was the highest voter turnout, in basically a century in a presidential election. And I think there's a lot of reasons why that happens. It was both Democrats coming out in record numbers and also Republicans coming out in record numbers. Donald Trump got more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. And it's really important to remember that. And frankly, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we were during a once in a century event of COVID-19. And this pandemic really shaped the 2020 election in so many ways. And one that I think is a bit underreported is how much easier it was to vote in 2020 because of all these emergency measures that were brought into place by towns, cities, states, and eventually basically the whole country, whether it's increasing the prevalence of vote by mail or no excuse absentee balloting, whether it's states that brought on online voter registration in a new way. We were seeing that it was much easier to participate in our election because of this crazy COVID pandemic than it really had been in a long time. And because of that, we had new folks, right? The number of new voters that showed up in 2020 who either didn't vote in 2016 or weren't eligible was much higher than in a typical presidential year. And that historic turnout of 2020 is a commonality that we see actually with this 2021 Virginia gubernatorial election, where we saw nearly 3.3 million voters show up in Virginia, something that looks much more like a typical midterm, even numbered year than you would see in an odd number gubernatorial race. And again, Terry McAuliffe got more votes than Ralph Northam did in 2017, but it wasn't enough. And Glenn Youngkin got even more. And so when we're in an environment where turnout is going to be crazy high, I think we've had a narrative that sort of solidified since the Obama campaign in 2008, that like high turnout equals good for Democrats. And I think we're starting to see the flip side of that, that perhaps that's not true. The one thing I would also say that I think is super important to remember about 2020, where I think a lot of folks are saying, wow, we hit this, Trump was on the ballot, we hit this high watermark on turnout, 2/3 of all Americans actually cast a ballot. Could we actually go higher? We had a whole campaign that decided, I think rightly in my opinion, not to go out and canvass. Whereas on the other side, we did have the Republican Party out there knocking on doors, persuading their people, getting their people out to the polls. I think we're in a world where we can go even higher. And so we'll see in 2022 and 2024, and I'll save this for the future talk. Sorry, Eliza, but we'll see that the America that shows up at the polls is going to look really different than it has in elections in a long time. And that has a big stakes for who wins and who loses.
All right, any other reflections, Hannah, Doug? I'll loop back here. No, okay. So we're gonna slightly pivot. We're going to where Ben is leading us, right? Looking to the future. And obviously Ben brought up the pandemic. That's one of a number of major things that our country has been experiencing and experiencing collectively as a country, but obviously impacting different communities in very different ways since the 2020 election. So we just add on to that the insurrection on January 6th. We add on to that the BLM movement. We add on to that varied changes happening at the state level in terms of voting access. So not all states are taking this up, and they're taking it up in very different ways. So there's major things that have been happening around this country in the midst of a once in a lifetime pandemic. So I'm going to ask the panelists to think about how do you anticipate that these events are going to come into play as we look to the midterms and then we look to the next presidential now 3 years from now. And I'll offer, maybe there's other things that you think are even more pressing than that and will be instructive to what we might see. So Doug, looks like you have something to say here. Came off mute quickly.
Those are all important issues, but I will tell you that the number one issue right now to voters is the economy and the cost of living. And things are increasing, the cost of whether it's prescription drugs, groceries. Glenn Youngkin ran a really smart ad on getting rid of the grocery tax in Virginia. That is what's on people's minds right now. Healthcare is also an issue. Obviously things in certain states, border security and immigration. I don't want to dismiss the issues you raised, Eliza. They are important to a lot of voters, a lot of different voters. But I think right now what's driving people is anxiety over, one, paying for things today, but also saving for the future. And there's a sense that we're going to turn over a country that's worse to our kids than we inherited. So I think one of the most important things that whether it's Republicans or Democrats do over the next year is to address that issue of economic insecurity. You can say economic inequality, wages, building wealth, whatever you want, but I think that's going to be one of the bigger issues that that both sides are going to have to try to communicate around. And I think Biden in particular, as he's looking for his reelection, he's got a lot of time until his reelection campaign, and a lot can happen in 3 years. But I think he's got to go back to what he won on, which was this sort of the steward of the middle class, and making sure that people have a pathway to the middle class, and we get rid of those obstacles, and that we do what we can to try to make sure that folks aren't paying, basically aren't going bankrupt paying for, basic needs. And so I think that 22 right now, if I had a magic, I don't know, if I had a magic ball, I would think that, that it would be about this issue of affordability. And that may change, the supply chain might come back, a lot can happen in 6 months, but right now, or a year, but right now, I think that issue of affordability is going to be top of mind of voters.
Yeah, let me chime in. I think Doug is spot on. That's why he's one of the best in the business. I want to speak on COVID for a minute. Obviously, many of my peers and folks just a bit older than me have kids who are getting vaccinated this week and last. I'd say my whole Instagram feed is full of smiling 7-year-olds with Band-Aids on their upper arms. And when you talk about the anxiety that's sort of gripping a lot of the country, we are hopefully having a big release of that anxiety a little bit. And in that next year, 6 months to a year, we could be in a situation where things are going back to normal, whatever back to normal means, as hopefully we continue to kick some tail against this virus. I'll say one thing that is a new normal that we'll have to address, and I think was really prevalent in this Virginia election, was the fact that a small contingent within the Republican Party has a large enough megaphone and media apparatus that is self-perpetuating and somewhat insular to drive narratives to reach Republican-based voters in a way that I don't think I've ever seen in my relatively short but somewhat more than a decade career. And when you have the ability to not just be a thermometer of take the temperature of where voters are, but actually be a thermostat and change their minds on what matters to them, the way that the Republican, far right infrastructure, I think, has, we get these invented issues like critical race theory that are obviously being so talked about in this Virginia election. And whether that's big enough to sway an election or not, I agree with Doug. The fundamentals are going to be about affordability and the economy and our recovery from COVID. But we have to recognize there's a new paradigm where 20% of the voters don't care what you have to say about something. They care about what they see 100 times a day on their Facebook feeds. And it's not ads, and it's not easy to regulate. It's a new normal. And that's going to continue to be tough in 2022 and 2024, especially if Donald Trump is back on the ballot, where we will see this disinformation machine spun up again. So that's something that I'm keeping my eyes on. And if anyone has any quick solution, just drop that in the chat. That would be super great. Appreciate it.
I think to touch on, both what Ben is saying and what Doug said in his first answer, the way that people have communicated has really fundamentally changed. And I think that has been coming for a long time with, like millennials not owning televisions or watching cable news, with people not having landlines, with like people not really having addresses. And you're seeing people be able to be removed more into their own bubbles. And that course has been coming, but it was so rapidly escalated by COVID, and it allowed people to really be in their own news cycles. And then even for, I grew up in Virginia, like should be getting all of the communications about a Virginia election. I got 2 text messages and that's it. Like, I think that people probably tried to call me. I got some like potential spams that I was screening, but the way that people are communicating is so different. And I think that that's going to be a huge challenge for who do people trust? Who do people feel comfortable trusting? And, to Doug's point earlier about needing to communicate with people extremely early to not make these assumptions that, the base is just going to come home. We really need to make sure that we're talking to people through trusted messengers, through ways that actually reach them. And I don't know that I really know exactly what that takes right now. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently because I don't feel like I was communicated with, and I don't know what it would take to communicate with people in this environment, and what are the tactics that are really going to work. And that's not going to change. I also think that there's a growing hunger for transparency among our leaders. And I think about people who are really incredible communicators like, AOC's Instagram, where she spends so much time demystifying what's happening in government and peeling back a layer so that people understand what's happening and what people are actually fighting for. People really want to understand. And it's politics has been so intentionally confusing for so long, and people really want to know what's happening. And you also see that, I think, in the importance of local election that's happening. Like last year, people were combing through city and municipal budgets in order to figure out what was happening with policing within that budget. And people are extremely invested in school boards right now, and they know that that's who's making decisions about what's happening to their kids in school, and that's what's happening with COVID. You've seen a lot around prosecutor races and other local level law enforcement races, and I think that that's going to continue. And there's a lot of excitement for people to understand, to run for office, to understand what's happening, to understand what the real impact of policy and politics is on every level of people's lives. And we need to figure out how to talk to people about, how that is impacting their lives, and make sure that it feels really digestible and understandable and not opaque, so that people know that, that people are trying and that the system is working for them. Because I think disillusionment in the system ends up being one of the huge reasons that people end up sitting out.
So in a number of your reflections, obviously there was things that you were agreeing with one another. I also heard tensions coming up, right? Which are the tensions that I'm sure that in both parties, people are talking about all the time, because there's the tensions between, as Hannah, you're saying, this real interest in understanding the issues, and you talked about the importance of getting to know the candidate, and that was a real lesson learned from 2020 as a success, and the consistency there. And then there's this total dependency on the sound bites and the short snippets and lots of information coming and sort of very quick news cycle. So those things can play in conflict to one another. And then there's the tension, Doug, you're talking about the anxieties that people are feeling, just like how are we going to A, stay alive, B, put food on the table with some of these big, bold issues that are being talked about by the parties, right? That can feel really far away. And so I want to acknowledge, right? And then we have a changing demographic, which all of you have sort of touched on. So as we go to sort of our next question, which is giving us a little bit of insight into the tensions you think are going on within each party right now, because for now we are still this two-party system. How are the two parties grappling with these tensions as they think about the midterms and the next presidential? Yeah, so I will open that one up. Maybe Ben or Doug, you might want to start there.
I'll go first on this one. Tensions are high. Maybe that's always true in politics, but it is real high right now, and some of this, this is we're not talking to any group of 75 randos. We're talking to Sidwell Friends, affiliated people who understand the inside baseball more than most. But I'll say, two tensions that I look for, one in each party. In the Republican Party, of which I'm not a member, we see this strange push-pull on folks who are trying to get stuff done versus folks who are trying to win, I guess. We see today, I think it's a great example, discussions inside the House Republican caucus about whether to kick the 13 members who voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, whether to kick them out of their committees. So we have people who believe in stonewalling for Stonewall's sake versus folks, I would say, who are interested in policy as the end result of government. And that's something that we're just in a world that I don't understand how it's going to work out. And we see this happening on every issue, whether it's Republicans who are willing to stand up to sort of the Donald Trump and attempted coup faction of the party getting primaried by Trump loyalists. It's a place where we have a lot of tension that I feel is very different than the sort of Tea Party versus moderate tension of 10 years ago. Instead, it's sort of Trump loyalist, sort of policy agnostic versus folks who are maybe more traditional, lowercase c conservatives. The tension inside the Democratic Party that I find interesting, and I'd be curious to hear what Doug and Hannah's tensions, which ones they find interesting. To me, I think we have an old guard that is, and I would put the president in this cohort, that believes we have a system of government that's not fundamentally broken, that believes the filibuster is a hallowed tradition and rule that we should uphold, that believes we have an America whose soul just needs to be restored rather than renewed, fighting against, I think, a much younger cohort that is more interested in, okay, the old rules don't work for us. What new rules can we put in place? And the reason that I focus so much on the structural and the rules about, how do we pass bills through Congress or how do we elect our leaders, is that our democracy really did fundamentally change on January 6th. We never before, as far as I'm aware, had to have a military leader potentially, disagree with their commander in chief as to whether to overturn an election or not. And so I think the interesting tension within the Democratic Party, and it doesn't line up on left versus center or moderate versus liberal, is really who feels like the system we've had for the last 250 years sort of works and just needs some tweaks, and who are the folks who are looking to sort of radically shake up the boggle. And that's just a big conversation. So, but I'm curious to hear what other folks think.
Doug, go to you.
I agree with Ben that tensions are high in both parties. They've been high for, quite some time. I think within the Democratic Party, I'm going to really simplify this, so forgive me, but I think you have a faction of the party that is focused on how do we win? And then we have a faction of the party that is how do we do big things? And what I mean by that is the nature of the Democratic caucus in the House in particular, but also in the Senate. In the House, you have frontliners, House Democrats who are 30 or 40 of them that are in the toughest districts, and they're focused on on getting reelected. And then you have a majority of the caucus that are in safe seats, and they don't have to worry about general elections. And so they're focused on, I think, they're focused on more, so how do we do the most with our position that we have in the time that we have. I don't think either is better or worse. I mean, look, in order to pass the infrastructure bill and Build Back Better and a number of, the COVID relief bill, you need to have the majority in the House. Being in the minority in the House is awful. I've worked in both the minority and the majority. Minority, you might as well not exist. Okay, it's the Senate is different. You have different rules over there. In the House, it's terrible. So you got to have a majority to do this stuff, right? But I do think that there is that tension between a smaller number of what we would consider moderates, but I'm not even sure if that's the right term. These guys are, vast majority of these Democrats are progressives and support the issues that progressives support, but they're focused, I think, on, okay, how do we win? How do we win? And I think that there's another portion that's focused on, okay, how do we do this? How do we do big things while we're in power? In the Republican Party, I think right now it's still a push and pull between folks who are sort of Trump loyalists, who are, just committed to him as a candidate or committed to his supporters, and will do nothing to offend them. Ben mentioned that there's now an effort to, go after on the Republican side the folks who voted for the infrastructure bill, the Republicans who voted for the infrastructure bill in the House, there were a bunch of senators in the Republicans in the Senate that did it as well. And if you remember the Trump administration, there was infrastructure week every week. So, it's not as if infrastructure is some sort of partisan issue, especially this bill, which was written by Republicans and Democrats. But because the former president got out there, now there's, that is causing, I think, a lot of, a lot of this energy to try to go after these folks. And I think it was Ben who mentioned the sort of right-wing media world, which is so effective in sort of distributing information, right or wrong information, to supporters. And now they're sort of on this kick to try to take out, these Republicans who supported the bill.
All right. Hannah, did you want to chime in here? We'll keep, okay.
I don't have anything else to add.
All right. So one thing before we move on to sort of our final set of topics, because we're running out of time, we had a number of questions. I think it's just worth just spending a couple minutes on here, just like on the security of our elections, right? Obviously, it was incredibly unsettling what we saw, not only on January 6th, but the challenges to the elections. This is an increasing cycle. We're seeing people installed at the state level, at local levels that clearly have very partisan perspectives. There was a number of questions asking our panelists just to reflect on sort of the security of our electoral system at this point, and what you're thinking is most important for people to be focusing on now that care about fair and accessible elections, and sort of what you might be anticipating come the midterms and the next presidential.
I can jump in to start that. Ben touched on this earlier, but we've seen like an incredible expansion of voting access through COVID. Like in Virginia, where I grew up, Virginia was 48th in this country for voting accessibility, and has moved up to being 12th in the country for voting accessibility, over partly because there was a trifecta and that was really committed to expanding voting rights, but also because we ended up getting things like, online voter registration, or easier voter registration, easier requesting things, no excuse early vote. All of these things that just make it so much easier and more accessible to do things. And we're seeing that across the country, that because people had to vote early, they needed to vote by mail in a more expanded fashion. A lot of those changes are sticking, and I think it'll be really interesting to see the way that the way that we're keeping those changes and making it easier and easier for people to be automatically enlisted to receive a vote by mail ballot, and all of those things that just help remind people about elections, especially primaries and off-cycle elections, and the ones that people usually miss out on. And so I think for all the talk that there is about, election security, we also are just seeing such tremendous expanded access. And there's still a lot of work to do, and a lot of voting rights bills that need to be passed, and a lot that needs to be done, especially to protect communities of color and other vulnerable communities for election, for voter suppression. And you'll see that across the country as well. But I think that the movement to make it more accessible through people needing to vote by mail and vote early has been really interesting to see as well.
Yeah, let me chime in with a not pessimistic to counter Hannah's optimistic, but more worried to counter your less worried. And this is the work I'm doing, sort of full time now, is thinking through what are the threats to our election system and how can we combat them in ways that we have agency. And so I'll shine a light on a couple ways that I think are perhaps not in the public sphere so often. The first is that many of our secretaries of state in this country are elected positions. And oftentimes those are super boring elections, because not a lot of people want to be in charge of an office that certifies business licenses and is in charge of elections and voter registration. Those races are about to be really unboring, as we have Trump-aligned Republicans running to basically oversee the election systems in states like Michigan, Arizona, Nevada. You may have heard of these states. They are swing states and really important for counting the electoral college votes in 2024. So just in 1 year from now, we're going to see Huge high profile elections for Secretary of State. I would encourage anyone on this call who is worried about the security of our elections to get involved in the Secretary of State's race. I would also say that's true for local election judges, county executives, mayoral races, where the place where our election administration rubber meets the road. Often these are elected positions, which means we have some agency to do something about them. One of the things that is a scary development here is that because of the influence of sort of the big lie and the insurrection and the sort of potentially violent Trump faction, we see a lot of turnover in those offices with folks who are deciding, I didn't sign up to get death threats or to have pictures of my kids published on the internet. I'm retiring from this seat, which means we have to do a much better job of encouraging pro-democracy forces and pro-voter forces to run for those races and help win those races. Often these are the sorts of elections that are only spent, $3,000 to $5,000 on the whole election campaign. So as Hannah mentioned, we're expanding the franchise in many ways. Obviously, in some states, Texas and Georgia in a very high profile way, the right to vote is being restricted. I would say oftentimes this is not done at the state level, it's at the local level. And we have a lot of work each of us can do to be really focused on those. Doug, what do you got? Give us some more optimism.
Well, look, I mean, if we're talking about the security, the question was originally about the security of our elections. That's right, Eliza?
Yes.
Okay, so if you look at 2020, the security actually was pretty good, and we were in the middle of a pandemic, and what we saw in 2016 with the Russian meddling, sure there were foreign actors who were trying to get involved, but certainly not to the extent that happened in 2016. And we also have, there's evidence, there's countless evidence of, the fact that in states across the country, these elections were run well, whether they're run by Republicans or Democrats, they were run well. And you had Republicans in Georgia and in Arizona and some other places who were the Secretary of State, who it's not even doing the right thing. They did their job, and they didn't get persuaded by, the party or the president to intervene and change rules. I think one of the more concerning things about the Georgia voting law that was passed and signed into law by the governor there, I think it's SB 202. And there was a lot that was discussed, I think, out there about, not being able to bring water to people in lines and all this other stuff, which I think is, I think it's missing the point. The bigger point is that they changed who is in charge of the state election boards. And they basically empowered the state legislature to appoint a stooge to oversee these state election boards. And they basically, and so what does that mean? That means that if there was a close election like in 2020 and 22 or 24, the state legislature has a lot of power to affect the outcome. The governor can also appoint someone when the legislature's not in session. So to me, this idea that like partisan politicians are now in this position, and that what Republicans are trying to do to change the outcome of elections is the scariest thing. I like a lot of the work that has been done though on the cyber side of things to keep our elections safe and secure. There's been a lot of resources that have been invested. I can't speak to the Republican side of things, but I know on the Democratic side of things, it's been a big deal. And there's been a lot of resources there, and I think it's paid off. And, I give a lot of credit to the Republicans and Democrats who worked all across this country in 2020 to make sure that these elections were run fair and accurate, and, really this idea that there's fraud is total nonsense. Like there were no evidence of that. But I'm really concerned about this, sort of what we saw in Georgia being replicated in other states.
Right, Hannah, did you want to chime in on this one?
I started with it, so we can go on to the next one.
Great, thank you for keeping me on track. So we've got a couple questions in. I'm going to start to sort of put them back to the panelists as we start to wrap up here and with some final comments. One was just to make sure if there's anything else that the three of you wanted to offer about your takeaways around lessons learned from 2020, 2021, and the rapidly changing demographics in this country. Full stop. And then as voters also, what do you anticipate sort of looking forward we're going to see in midterms and the next presidential from either party, or just generally about engagement in the electoral process? Anyone want to? I know you've touched on that in different ways, but I think it's.
I guess I'll just say to continue to reiterate a theme that I think a lot of us have been saying, we just need to be really clearly communicating with people and making sure that they really know what's happening. And, you know, that from concrete like policy things to what's happening to how, you know, to the anxieties that people are facing, and making sure that they feel able to get factual information that they can trust. I think there are so many ways that people just don't feel like they have access to information that they can trust, to like making sure people have voting information that they trust. So much of what we really need to do is make sure that people feel like they know where to go and that they can get accurate information, and that they feel also like trusted and credible messengers as they're talking to people. I think one of the challenges that we had on the Warren campaign is that we had a quadrillion plans and so much policy, and we attracted really wonky people who felt so nervous about trying to represent our plans. And that becomes really complicated, and we just need people to feel, and we spent a lot of time trying to make sure we were like, you don't need to be an expert, just like go talk about what matters to you. Here's a place where you can get some like accurate information so you feel comfortable. And I think making sure that people feel like they know, you know, have places to go where they can trust and get information, and that they don't get sucked into like a disinformation TikTok web is incredibly important for making sure that that, you know, people are feeling confident going into the next election.
Doug, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, I would just say that I think, you know, just on the Democratic side of things, I just think it's really important that the party does a better job of diversifying the people who work within the party. You know, and that's not just racial or ethnic or gender. That's also socioeconomic. We have a real problem with non-college educated voters, not just white non-college educated voters, but people of color as well. You saw in 2020 that that Biden's numbers with non-college educated Black voters and Hispanic voters dropped. We saw something similar in 21. I'm seeing it in focus groups and polling for many of my candidates. And that's just sort of like a fluency in terms of talking about these issues that these folks are dealing with every day, and having some cultural fluency as well. And I don't think that, and I worry that the party, does not have that. I also think that they need to do a better job of enlisting people of color to be consultants for the party committees. Certainly need more women as well. But I think that if we're gonna, if we're gonna sort of have any chance in 22, and I think if we're gonna keep the White House in 24, a lot of these changes are they're institutional. They need to, we need to do a better job of broadening our tent. And I hope that happens, and because I think that impacts the message, which I started off with. If the people who are constructing the message of the party have no experience with the lives of the people that they're trying to communicate with, the message is not going to be authentic. It's just going to be political consultant, nonsense, right? And I'm one, but like, but I also feel like that if you don't I have an authenticity to what you're talking about and a lived experience, then those messages do not resonate. They don't feel real. And so, you know, I think that's really, and that starts with the people that you have in the party.
All right, I'm going to do a final round here, I think. I'm not yet getting the, cut it from Anna, so maybe we have a minute or two left. Okay, great. So this is a little bit of just asking you all to share what's making you excited, who's making you excited. So this can be open. I just want to say that we've gotten questions coming in about different types of elections, like, we don't have time to discuss, ranked choice voting and the idea of getting rid of the electoral college. So there's more structural things, even than what Ben talked about. And he was our structure guy today. And so I apologize that we haven't been able to talk about that, but clearly, right, sort of how the elections are structured, right, and how we're running them has deep impact on what we're going to be able to see and how people are going to be able to access and how real they feel like their vote is going to really matter. So that said, looking forward and feeling excited, we're going to do a quick round here of like, who or what organizations are you all watching that you think are doing excellent work in this space? And this is coupled to the question that a number of folks have asked about, like, what can I do as an individual getting ready for this next cycle? And so we'll keep it less focused on specific candidates, but more on supporting the structure and the importance of elections. Who wants to go first?
I'll kick us off, and I'll try to be brief. I'll give you a person, an organization, one thing you can do. A person that I am really inspired by, who I think is a rising star, is a congressman from Colorado named Joe Neguse. I think he embodies a lot of the values that Doug was just talking about. He's a millennial, Black, first-generation American who is a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and a member of Nancy Pelosi's leadership team. He is essentially one of the key reasons why we got this infrastructure bill across the finish line, convincing enough members of the Progressive Caucus to vote yes. He is a guy who's going places. He's a friend. And I think you should all support him. So Joe Neguse. An organization that I think is super cool is an organization that's called LIT, Leaders Igniting Transformation. The LIT Action Fund is LIT AF. So any millennials or Gen Zers on the call know why that's funny. They are doing work all across the state of Wisconsin, a place that is dominated by sort of old white folks in hollowed out towns across former industrial heartland. What LIT is doing is connecting with the young people in those communities, be they Black, white, Latino, Native, Asian, and building a strong youth power structure in the great state of Wisconsin, which we know will be important for years to come. So give them all your money. And then one thing that you can do, something I would encourage everybody to do because it's really hard, is find the people in your life who don't agree with you and make it your business to be talking to them over the course of the next years about politics and getting them to be persuaded by you to go out and do the right thing. We all would love to just write postcards and make phone calls to a bunch of strangers because we feel really confident in doing that. But instead, it's actually reaching out to those people that we do know, even if it is your favorite, least favorite, step uncle's brother, and encouraging them to side with democracy and not with fascism. That's my message to y'all. Thanks for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. Hannah or Doug? Closing comments. Folks to learn.
So in terms of people I'm excited about, we actually have a really great crop of candidates running for governor and Senate on the Democratic side, a lot of diverse candidates. We have a really interesting new sort of wave of leaders in the House that I'm excited about. And I'll give you names. And, you know, I think that as we're looking into, you know, as we're looking at 22, I think there's a real opportunity to elect folks who are, you know, who are young, who are diverse, who are super talented. I think of, on the gubernatorial side of things, he's a client of mine, but I'm still going to put his name out there, and that is Wes Moore, who is running for governor of Maryland. He wrote a best-selling book called The Other Wes Moore. I don't know if that's being read in Sidwell, but it should be. He was a combat veteran, just fantastic. And there are other folks who are out there that I think are very appealing. Sherry Beasley, who's running for the Senate in North Carolina, Mandela Barnes, who's running for governor, for the Senate in Wisconsin, Malcolm Kenyatta, who's in Pennsylvania. The last name I would leave you with is Hakeem Jeffries, a House guy, like a colleague of Joe Neguse. Hakeem is likely to be the next leader of the House Democrats in the next, whenever it may be, in the next 2 or 4 years. I strongly believe he will be the leader of the House Democrats. He's from New York, very telegenic, very smart, just a superb person. So those are people that I'm actually really excited about, like the future of the Democratic Party and leaders there. And and I think that as it relates to organizations, I would say that one of the biggest spenders in 2020 was an organization called Future Forward. They're looking at being a big player in 22. And then an organization called Climate Power as well, who's doing all of the ads right now to support frontline House Democrats and senators around the Build Back Better and infrastructure bill.
Those are all great suggestions, and I'm not going to name names, but what I would say is that I feel to the point Doug was making earlier, that we're seeing more and more people who are bringing their lived experience being impacted by politics into the work that they're doing. We're seeing that in candidates, we're seeing that in organization leaders, we're seeing that in organizers. And I think being able to see people who are able to come and tell their story and talk about why they are running and why it matters so much for them and their community, for them to do this work, to me is extremely exciting and great that is who is in power, and not just like the same parade of white men with law degrees. And it's really great to see that change. And so I'm really excited for what the future holds there.
Awesome. Well, I'm just going to tag on to that because it feels like it's an appropriate segue that financing of our elections is yet another topic that we did not cover in our brief hour. But certainly this was a resounding sort of plea and plug for us to make it more accessible and appealing for people with lived experiences to be part of this process, whether that's as candidates or as practitioners or staff. And right now we have an electoral system that is it's expensive, so expensive to even play. And so we can certainly see the ways in which that could come into conflict there. So maybe that's teeing up for a future Friends conversation. Feels like we could be gathering right every Tuesday night for the next however when, because there's always things that are changing and more to discuss. But Hannah and Ben and Doug, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everybody here for spending an hour together. And Anna, we will turn it back to you, I think. Does that work?
Thank you so much. I'll echo Eliza's thanks to our 3 panelists. We so appreciate you being here tonight. Hannah, Doug, Ben, thank you for your amazing insights, for sharing your observations and your opinions and your experience in this industry so candidly and so thoughtfully. And Eliza, thank you for leading us through this phenomenal conversation. We appreciate you so much. My thanks to all of you for joining us. The Conversation with Friends series is really about you. It's about this community. And we've brought up so many different topics over the last 18 months, from current events and politics to books to race and identity to photography and storytelling. We've really run the gambit. So my plea is, if you have a great idea for a Conversation with Friends event, please let us know. We have several in the works for the new year that we're really excited to share more information about with you very soon, but we're also very eager to hear your ideas. So, email us, give us a call, send a carrier pigeon, whatever works for you, but let us know what you want to see from this series down the road. And just one more time, thanks for being with us tonight, and we'll see you very soon.